You know, as a preacher, I've often asked myself, why in the world do people come to church so regularly? You know, why do they give up time out of their busy schedules to come and participate in worship? I know it's not because I'm so pretty and charming. I know that it's not because the sermons are so compelling and meaningful. There's something more to it. Well, in part, we come because of habit, and there's nothing wrong with that, because habits are good things. We do a lot of good things out of habit. We brush our teeth. We say please and thank you, I hope. We say I love you at the end of phone conversations. We kiss our spouse and our children before we leave the house. We do things out of habit because we've made a decision long ago that they're good things to do. And so we've inculcated them as traits and practices that mean something to us, even if we're not mindful of them at the moment. And so there's nothing wrong with coming to worship or clicking through YouTube and Facebook on a Sunday morning, because that's our habit. It's what we do. And how could we go about our day if we didn't begin with worship? And I know that's one of the reasons people come. I think another reason that people come to worship is because they have things they want to say to God. I know I do. I experience myself as a sinner, and I want to come to God and say, I am broken and sinful, and I need your forgiveness. And I desire your reconciling love, and I want to be made better and whole and put together again. I come to God because I want to say thank you, because I've experienced good things in my life. And so I want to offer thanksgiving for those things. And I come to express my needs, not only mine, but the needs of people who I know and love, and the needs of the world, which just press in on us from every corner. In this time of uncertainty and violence and partisanship and just everything being turned upside down, we come to God and we offer our experience before God and say to God, bring us, we pray, to some wholeness and peace in the midst of this. And that's part of the reason we come to worship, is to be able to lift up those concerns in the presence of God. But I think what underlies all of that is a desire to be encountered by God, to have deep cry out unto deep, that the deep center of ourselves might be encountered by the eternity that is God. And I think that's what motivates us. And in old days when we came in person, it motivates us to get up and get shaved and put on shoes and sit in an uncomfortable pew. But it motivates us to find something on YouTube or Facebook and to endure the time that it takes to set that up and to watch it and to interrupt our day, because we want to have an experience of God. We need that, and somehow we know it. But the question is, how do we prepare ourselves for this meeting with God? And what is it that we hope for out of this experience with God? And I think we prepare ourselves and we hope for a blessing. We come to God in anticipation that being in the presence of God is somehow going to bless us. It's going to sanctify us. That's a very fancy religious term that means make us congruent, make us whole, put us together, take our fragmented and broken self and weld it into one, make it appropriate to everything in our life so that we would feel whole and put together. To be blessed, that's what we want. And so when I think about our readings this morning, I think that the story of Jacob is so much really our story. Now I know Jacob was really not a great guy, not really somebody we want to emulate in terms of our moral behavior. And I don't mean to insult anybody by saying that we're like Jacob, but I think there's a lot of us that's in Jacob, especially that desire that Jacob has to get the blessing that he can see in front of his nose. Now, we might not employ the same improper means that Jacob used to get those blessings, but we go after things that we want, and we see them as, well, this would be the way that we could get meaning and purpose in our lives and joy and happiness, and so we're going to go after them, just as Jacob did. And you know, his whole life story is one long quest to get a blessing. He hornswoggles his brother's birthright. He deceives his father in order to get the paternal blessing, right? He works for 14 long years to have the blessing of being married to the woman who he loves. and he works another 7 years beyond that to get the material blessing so that he can be independent of his uncle Laban. He is a person who has done things both virtuous and persistent and also manipulative and dishonest in order to grab a blessing that he wants. And I think that he is not at all unlike us. Because when we see that we'd like to have something in our lives and we feel that it would make our lives complete, we throw ourselves at it. And sometimes we are not entirely picky about the means we use to pursue the blessings we desire. Maybe I'm just projecting onto you my own weakness of character. But I think I'm not that different than you are. And I think neither of us are that different than Jacob. Jacob, throughout his life, has been questing after this blessing that he's desirous to experience and to have as his own. And the irony is that as he's pursuing this blessing, he's still absent from the blessing that God has promised his father and his grandfather, because he now is a rich man, and he's married to the wife he loves as well as several who he doesn't care much about, and he's got a nice big family, 11 kids, and he's got a lot of wealth, but he's not in the promised land. And that's what Abraham and his father Isaac were promised. That's the promise that should fall on him. That's the blessing that he should expect, and he doesn't have it yet. And one of the reasons he doesn't have it is precisely because he sought to get the blessing through his own wiliness. And so he became an exile, virtually, because of his fear of his brother Esau, who he had defrauded and cheated and alienated. And since Esau had threatened to kill him, he fled. And 20 years later, he is still in exile when we pick up his story today. You see, in all of Jacob's life, he has only known the real blessing of God, the real encounter with God that we all long for twice. Once was immediately after he fled from his brother's murderous rage, when he was leaving home with nothing. And he was fearful that Esau would find him, and he slept in the middle of the desert. And there he had that visionary dream of angels ascending and descending. And there God spoke to him the same promise of blessing that God had spoken to Abraham and Isaac before him. And then again, in the story that we read this morning, Jacob experiences this phenomenal encounter with God that is for him the source of blessing. But it comes to him in a very Jacobian way. That is to say, he's met by a stranger, and they wrestle until dawn. And it's only then that Jacob wrestles this stranger, who turns out to be the divine, and receives a blessing and a new identity. He's called Israel and not Jacob. How does he get those blessings? Well, he gets them precisely when he's at the end of his rope. You see, it is only an empty vessel that's able to be filled. And Jacob, all his life, was trying to finagle and wangle a blessing, to try and grab it and manufacture it. But that's not how you get the genuine blessing. You can get a lot of good things that way, but you can't get the encounter with the living God by your own strength, by your own manufacture, by your own pursuit. And so Jacob discovers that. He discovers that God meets him twice in his life, and in both occasions he's got nothing left. The first time, he's running away from home, afraid of his brother's intention to kill him. And the second time, he's coming back home, but he's still afraid of his brother's perhaps still existent intention to kill him. And so before Jacob takes a step into the homeland, he sends all of his family across the river ahead of him. He sends all of his wealth across the river ahead of him. He hopes to placate and soften his brother Esau, and he also hopes to giving him gifts and showing him his extended family that he will decide not to kill his brother. But he doesn't know. In that night when he has the encounter with the angel, Jacob has nothing left in the world. All of his family is away from him. All of his wealth is away from him. All he has is him and God. And it's there that he experiences, in that encounter, the real blessing that he needs, because it's only an empty vessel that's able to be filled. And that also holds true in our gospel lesson. You will notice that Jesus feeds the 5,000, not at an all-you-can-eat buffet, but out in the desert where the crowds have gathered to hear him, and there are no places for them to find forage and food. And it's there that he reveals that he is indeed the bread of heaven, the manna that's been given to them so that he might be bread for the journey. And so when he takes and blesses and breaks and gives, he reminds us all that we come to the table just as those people came to Jesus out there in the desert. We come as beggars who have learned where the bread is. We come as empty vessels waiting to be filled. We come as the invitation to the Eucharist says, not because we must, but because we may. Not because we're fulfilled, but because in our emptiness we seek a blessing and a presence, mercy and life. If we are going to receive what we desire, that is, an encounter with the living God, we have to give up the anxious quest for it of our own ambition, of our own striving. And we have to recognize that it is an empty vessel that can be filled. And we also have to accept that you may not enter into the promised land whole. The encounter that Jacob has with the angel changes him. His hip is put out of joint. He walks into the promised land with a limp. And your encounter with God may be all sweetness and light, but that has not always been my experience. That often when I have been in the presence of God, it has cost me something. It has shaped and turned my life in ways that have not always been present. But it leaves a mark. And sometimes it leaves us limping. But better to enter the promised land limping than to wander with all of our strength in darkness and lost. When Jacob is done wrestling with God, he does limp across the Jabbok, and he enters into the promised land. And there he encounters his brother Esau, his twin brother Esau, his divided self, his neglected, his despised self, his lost half of himself. And when he sees Esau, who now is reconciled to him, in their embrace, in their peacemaking, Jacob says to Esau, looking at your face is like seeing the face of God. When we let go of striving to bless ourselves and we release all of our means of security and power, then we are in a position to be met by God. And that meeting, it may indeed be a difficult meeting for us. And it will certainly mark us, and it may leave us wounded. But the encounter prepares us to enter the land of promise and to be united there with our truest self, to make peace with the whole of us, because the whole of us has come under the blessing of God, and to see ourselves in the presence of God, who has not only marked us with a limp, but has made us a dwelling for the presence of God in the world. That's the blessing that God has prepared for us. May it be ours.